So the first knowledge area we're going to talk about is project integration management. Now, you'll see on the slide it's numbered 4. And let me explain how some of this numbering goes. And you need to be careful because of the numbering, because there's a lot of different versions that are floating out there right now. Versions of the PMP, which is the main source of a lot of this information. The 4 on this slide refers to the chapter that integration management talks about, or is talked about in the book. So that's for the numbering will reflect that to a certain degree. Now, all of these knowledge areas have certain processes within them. And what we're doing is we'll look at the knowledge area, we'll look at the processes that are noted within that knowledge area, and we'll talk about some detail about those things. We'll talk inputs, outputs, tools and techniques, and we'll get into some level of detail so that you really understand what they're talking about. The first, project integration management. Here in integration management, we're talking about 7 distinct processes. The 4.1, 4.2, 4.3, 4.4, 4.5, and 4.6 are already been numbered. The manage project knowledge is a new process which we'll talk about, but it has not been put in, the edition is not out yet. So we're not going to number this, just we're making you aware of it as a new process that's been identified, and we'll talk a little bit about it. The develop project charter is 4.1. That is, we'll get in a good bit of detail about how a project is actually put together, and that's the charter, helps direct that. Develop the project management plan, direct and manage the project work, monitor and control project work, perform integrated change control, manage project knowledge, and close the project or phase. We'll get into all of those pieces as part of the integration management. Now, down at the bottom of this chart, you'll see I have 7 of 50. That's just there to give you a clue. Depends on how you want to look at these. I am assuming, and I will highly suggest that as part of this, you use the supporting material we have with this video that has questions and has other things that you can quiz yourself as you learn, as you hear this. You can do some quizzing to help reinforce the information. It's very important in the integration management and the other knowledge areas to do that. So let's start. Here's our first one. We have develop the project charter. The inputs for that include the project statement of work. If you have a statement of work, maybe a contract that you have, it could be a vendor type of solution, so you have a vendor's statement of work. It could be internal. We have a business case. A lot of projects have business cases, and to develop the charter, you need to know what was expected, how much was the return on investment, how the business case was put together. That can be a vital part of the charter. We have agreements. Again, if you are working within an organization that has long-term vendor agreements that need to be followed, then you need to be aware of those. Those would be part of the charter and need to be part of how you are moving forward with your work. Again, here's your enterprise environmental factors raising their head and input to this particular process that we go through in developing the project charter. You will see these over and over again. I start initializing these as we get further in, but I wanted you to see it here so you know, yep, we've talked about it and we're going to be using them, as well as the organizational process assets. So these are inputs into developing the project charter. The tools and techniques that we use here, expert judgment. You will see this again. It's expert judgment that we use as a way of saying we have people who know what they're doing in in working projects, you're not working from a position of ignorance. You're working from a position of expertise, and you should be either bringing those experts in or exerting your own expertise as part of this, as a tool to be able to develop the charter and make it successful for the project charter. We also use facilitation techniques in this particular process. Why would we use facilitation techniques? Well, we're trying to lay the foundation for the project. The charter really does show what we're trying to do and how we're trying to do it, and it gives us that solid foundation to move forward from. Now, not everything has to be agreed to at first. Some project charters are a plan to put a plan together, if you will. So they're not detailed to the nth degree, but you do have to facilitate that agreement between your stakeholders and your sponsors and sometimes the team. The people, it's one of those tools that facilitation techniques is one of those tools you should always have in your toolbox, if you will. I think of my toolbox as a very virtual thing and a very active one. That some tools I don't use all the time, some tools I use every day. But you don't always need a hammer. Sometimes you need a screwdriver. So it's knowing what your tools are and what they can do. That's very important to the project manager. And here are 2 different tools that we've put in your toolbox already. The output is the charter. The charter is a document. It should have some formality about it. Generally, it has agreed upon pieces. So in the charter development, we're talking about developing business case. Now, a business case is typically something that explains why you're doing something. So it's a justification in a sense. It's an understanding between people, and it's from a business perspective. You define the objectives of what you're trying to do with the project. Doesn't have to be in great detail, but it should be specific enough. It also should note, what is your benefits? Why are we doing this? We don't, if we're doing something, we should have a justification, a reason for doing it. We shouldn't just be doing it because someone thinks it's a good idea without understanding why it's a good idea. The business case helps to give you that information. It helps you to develop the project scope. What are we doing? So we need to understand the objectives of the project, the expectations of what we're doing for the business, and it helps us know what the scope is, better define it. Now, we don't have to have it in great detail, but we should know that we're developing a software package and not building a house. Those are the broad stroke kind of things that we need to have an understanding of. Or even more specific, we're building a point of sales system, not a customer database for some other purpose. You have to be clear with some of the broad term directions, or you can be confused from the start. So that's what we're trying to do. We may get some estimates of time, cost, resources. Who do we need? What are the types of people? What's the broad stroke time? Are we doing this in a month, in a year, in 5 years? Those are important to have an understanding. What is your basic cost? Are we spending $1 million to do this? $5 million? Again, if you are talking about your expected business benefit, you should have an understanding of how much cost there is so that you can understand how much return that you're expecting. You shouldn't spend $1 million to get yourself a $500 return. That's not the way to do business, and no one would do it that way. But these are the details that you would have in your business case. You would also have the possible cost-benefit analyze the costs against the benefits, and really have some specifics there. It may be that you are doing this in its estimates, and it's based on, if we bring it in 3 months, it can be this. If we bring it in 6 months, it'll be that. And it can be a sliding scale. It might even be a matrix of some sort that you've put together. And there should be some idea in your business case of the risk. As we get talking about risk more, you'll see how this is a part of it. And I hope you've noted that in this knowledge area, talking about this information, we've already started blending some of the other knowledge areas within this spectrum of the PMBOK and how to do project management in this sort of those standards. Because scope is there, time is there, cost is there, resources are there, risk are there. All of these are important elements that we can't just look at independently. They're all important, and we look at them time and time again. So analyzing the business need, defining your business need. And here's one way of looking at it. You define your business problem. One of the definitions of a project is a solution to a business problem. Why do we do projects? We do projects because we have problems. We don't do projects without having a problem. That's just good common sense. Here, we're going to look at a simple way of looking at that, and it's the 3 C's. The 3 C's are, we do projects for these 3 reasons. There's cost, savings, or opportunity. You have a cost that you're trying to recoup, or you have an opportunity, you're trying to sell a new product, the iPhone comes out, or the new Android, or whatever your products are, you're trying to capitalize on the cost. So you're trying to make money. Or the other next C is customer. You're trying to gather customers, or you're trying to keep customers, but customer is another dramatic solution that you may be trying to get. It's one of those biggies. We need customers. And this works either if you're in a nonprofit or a profit-making situation. You can think of your clientele as your customer, and you're trying to gather more, keep the ones you have, etc. And the last C is compliance. What I like to think of as to stay out of jail. You're trying to be compliant within the regulations of your industry, within the legal structures that you are under. And sometimes that's why we do a project. We do a project for no other reason but to stay within the legal constraints. For instance, I mentioned in an earlier lecture about number portability, the ability for you to take your phone number from one service provider to another. That was, again, done not for cost savings necessarily, nor really for our customers. It was done because the government said you will do this. So even if we couldn't justify it on cost, we were still going to have to do it because the government had had passed legislature that said you will do this. That happens in a lot of different industries, and it should be always taken into account as a reasoning behind any project you do and in your analysis of your business needs and problems. There's also should be some kind of a gap analysis. Now, a gap means just that. There's a hole between something that's known and something that's not known. And there's lots of different models of how to do gap analysis. But your business needs, when you're looking at your problems, it could be anything from where we are now to where we want to be. That can be the gap. Or it can be, I have 1,000 customers and I want 1 million. How do we bridge the gap? Can we do this incrementally? How do we know what's happening? So gap analysis is an important factor that you should take into account in this process. Now, the project justification, it includes a lot of different elements, and the idea here is that in your charter, it might have this, and it might be very, very brief. It could be 25 words or less. It can be tight, but it can include a lot of these elements. Like the justification can be just your explanation. What am I doing? And what are the objectives? What's the scope of, and maybe I have a scope statement. I worked on a project that our scope statement was we want to deliver to the citizens of North Carolina the ability to pay their vehicle property tax when they register their car. That was it. And it had many parts, and I showed you that in the lecture on programs. There were 4 distinct pieces, but the statement, which is what I'm talking about here, was very succinct. Your justification might have the strategic fit or purpose. Now, don't mistake the scope statement with the strategic purpose. Your strategic purpose is that bigger picture, and it can talk directly to the company's overriding long-term strategic vision. It may be that your strategic vision for a company is to automate all reports so that we don't have a lot of one-off reporting that's done. And I've worked for companies like that. And if that's the strategic vision, you might be able to justify automating a report and spending, $100,000 to automate a report that's fairly simple, but it's justified based on its strategic importance. We want to get away from small hand-done reports that take people's time, and we want to automate it so that it automatically comes out when we need it, monthly, weekly, daily, whatever. So that's how you can, even if a scope of something and a business justification may be slightly askewed, you may not see how you are actually making money by automating something. The strategic vision may override that. The idea that it is important in and itself to automate all these reports that we're hand doing. So just an example of the strategic fit and how this works into the project justification. And you need to look at, in justification, your competitive technical landscape. Are you, if you're doing something, you should be trying to stay up with other people, maybe, if that's part of it. Do we want to get behind? But it needs to be thought through. And a lot of this, especially when we're talking the business need, the project charter, all these factors should be thought through. They taken into account. Maybe some of them aren't as pertinent in a specific project, but again, like the tools in our toolbox, not everything here we will use every time, but we shouldn't discard it without thought. Do we have a strategic fit or purpose for this project? Well, okay, yeah. What is it? Do we have something that's in the competitive landscape out there that we need to take into account? Yes or no? If we do, then let's note it. It's part of our justification. It gives us reasoning behind it and helps us present a better way of spending money. And remember, projects are the spending of the corporate's assets for some reason. And as we looked at before, it can be cost, customer, compliance, in those categories generally. But it should fit in with that, and you should be able to talk to that in reasonable and brief ways. Some kind of a financial analysis is always nice in your justification. You want to say why we're doing it, and having some idea that if we spend $5, we'll make 10, and we'll make it in a time frame that's acceptable, so the investment makes sense. But having some idea of the financial analysis, and it doesn't, at this point, you don't have to be, remember, the charter is the beginning. So you might not have all the details yet, but you should have a pretty good idea of what you're trying to do. That, is it a good idea or a bad idea? Some people look at project justification, and even in project charter development with the business case, et cetera, as trying to build a good reason to spend corporate assets to make other assets. So you may have to defend yourself or sell this to stakeholders and sponsors, to the C-suite, whatever it is, how you, in your particular organization, they do this. But that's really kind of where we're talking about justification and a lot of this with the charter. Again, any risks that you've identified, things that might happen. I'll go a great deal of detail about risk, but just for now, think about risks are the things that might happen, good or bad, but things that might happen down the road. So you want to try and identify those early on. Any assumptions you're making. Are you assuming that the budget will be passed for next year, or we're not going to be able to sell to the government? That we may have a delay there. You might have constraints that you want to note. Anything from we need to have this in before the beginning of the retail season. In the wireless industry, the retail season is sometime close to the 1st of November into January generally. And that's a constraint on every project because you need special permission to move code in on applications during that time frame. Why? Because they sell most of their phones in that time frame. So they don't want any risk of there being outages that could affect their sales. So that's a constraint on that industry specific. Other industries have other constraints. Car sellers want to sell the cars before the end of their fiscal year or end of their calendar year, if that's the case, and they do incentives, but that's a constraint that would be there. And some people's constraints are other people's assumptions. So it's a matter of thinking through some of the natural things that we would need to have in our minds as we move this project from into is it a good idea to can we do it, can we plan it, etc. And that's really in this charter, we're trying to make sure we're really doing the right thing. Is there a conceptual solution? What we're talking about here is, it's one thing to say, I want a communication device that I can talk to my mother on. It's another thing to have it, to know that there are wireless devices out there that I can leverage, that if I have the right network, that I can have that type of device, and we can get it in her hand and my hand, and we talk. There may be a prototype that has been done. There may be other projects you're leveraging. There may be industry standards you're looking at and trying to build upon. But do you have a kind of a concept of what the solution can be at the beginning? And you may not know all the answers yet, but if you have a conceptual solution, why not put it out there, even if it changes? Is there any key resource requirements? You might put that in your justification. I need resources. Remember, resources can be people or they can be things. So if my project has to have a supercomputer, then I need to have that as a key requirement, if that's what you have ascertained through your research. If it needs a brilliant mathematician, You need to have that as a key resource requirement. Anything like that needs to be part of that because it helps decision makers decide whether to move forward with a project or not. So this justification and these elements are not insignificant, nor do they have to be in such detail that you get paralyzed, if you will. A lot of people call it analysis paralysis, where you're analyzing things, trying to get too much detail, and you end up not being able to get anything done because you're busy researching and making sure you don't make a mistake. This is a kind of a grocery list of elements that should be thought about. They may or may not have as much regard to different projects as others. One way a student of mine once shared with me, they said, they took a project management class, and they were like, what they taught us was we need to know what done looks like. When are we done? When are you complete? And this is sort of what we're talking about with success, completion, acceptance criteria, successful. What does done look like? When do we know we're done? Some projects, it's very distinct. Some projects, you have it really drawn out there. When the car rolls off the assembly line, you're done. Or when the customer buys the first phone, you're done. Or very concrete type of acceptance. When the customer gives me a sign off that I'm done, then I'm done. I have an acceptance criteria, and we should have an idea, even in our justification. How do we know what that success is? How do we know that this is acceptable? When I've mentioned in previous lectures about cleaning my garage. Well, one of the things, if I were putting a charter together that said, successful completion, I want to know, I need acceptance criteria, I would go to a very powerful stakeholder in that situation, and I would ask her what her acceptance criteria was. So if my wife said, I need to be able to park my car in the garage, and that's part of my acceptance criteria, I need to know that. So that I don't I'm not misled or do the wrong thing. The same thing happens with every other project that you're working on. You need to understand what's acceptable and what's not. And acceptance criteria in this case is not the bare minimum, but it's a clear vision of what that looks like. And that's what we're kind of talking about. And it's never too early in putting a charter together to have thought through that and at least have those discussions of what is acceptable, what does success look like. Now, this is a matrix of decision making. Sometimes there are projects that we have, and we need to decide which one do we want to do. And of the potential projects we see over here, we have different criteria: ease of implementation, cost, potential impact, urgency, most requested obstacles, and then there's some totals. And then we've weighed these things out a bit, of which are more important than other things. And then you'll see here are our projects: improve data throughput speeds, develop online vacation schedule, et cetera, et cetera. You can see these projects, and they're scored out here, and we get totals. How this is used, how this kind of a device, this tool that we're looking at is used, is that you have multiple projects that are vying for your corporate's assets. And what you need to be able to do is to make reasonable decisions about where to put those assets. Now, how do you do that? You do that through putting tools together that can show you where the most important stuff is, where the projects that need your attention are. And the reason we we do this is because we're always at risk if we don't make informed decisions based on some kind of device or technique. We may be putting our money in the wrong place. This helps us take what's in our heads as opinion and put it into some justification, if you will, some way of looking at it that's more than just, well, I thought it was a good idea at the time. And unfortunately, a lot of places do that. In this methodology, when we talk about being a project manager, you should always be thinking of that I am spending corporate assets. How do I do that best? I am the guardian or the steward of corporate assets. In this part of what we're talking about in the very beginning of doing charters and identifying and defining our projects, we need to be looking at that even now. These are used in other places. This is simply a matrix of decision making, and it's used in dozens of places. So the charter, it's a formal document. It has a scope, it has the objectives, it can say who's the participants. For instance, if your charter says we're going to hire someone to come in, are we going to procure this service? Are we going to use somebody who's already here? Are we reassigning someone to this project? Those kinds of things. It also outlines those objectives. It identifies the main stakeholders who are affected by the project. We'll talk about stakeholder management as one of our knowledge areas in this program. Understand identifying these stakeholders early is important, and it's formal, so you put it in writing. It says these are the important people that need to be aware of this project. They need to either participate in it or they need to be aware they're affected, either by some of the inputs that we need from them or some of the outputs that we expect to have from this. And the stakeholders can be real or proxy. They can be actual people or your concept of a customer. It's kind of that proxy customer that we sometimes talk about. We define them, their demographics. You know, am I selling this to 50-year-old men? Or am I selling this to 13-year-old girls? Who is the people out there? As much detail as you can come up with, but that needs to be part of this charter, a clue of who your stakeholders are. And we're talking a preliminary delineation of roles and responsibility. Who's doing what? So you've talked about what are you trying to do? You should have a justification in your charter of why it's important to do it. So I'm going to do this XYZ. And we have a pretty good idea we'll make money on it if we do it right. Now, who's going to do it? I'm bringing this person in from the outside. I'm bringing that person in from this other group. And maybe you're going to send part of the work overseas. Whatever is the detail that you have initially is good to document. It can change. But if it's not documented to begin with, you don't know, it's hard to have a good roadmap. Project management, good project management is all about having good roadmaps. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do. This particular knowledge area, this process of developing your charter is about that good roadmap. And not least, and this is an important thing for certification, know that the charter defines the authority of the project manager. We talked earlier about different kinds of organizations. Some are matrixed, some are not. Part of what the charter will help do is define that authority. It sometimes gives it to a specific person as a project manager. So it's not simply, we'll have a project manager. Some are written that way. but it can be Alan Evans is the project manager of this project and gives me authority to spend money. That's what a project can do. I can hire people or not, or I'm restricted in some way of who I can get. We're going to, part of this, the charter could be a statement of that we're going to issue an RFP to bring in people. That's a request for proposal. And we'll talk about that in procurement later on. But the idea here is there's a lot that can be part of this, and part of it is the authority that the project manager actually has. And it is part of the charter that gives the authority to the project manager. And it can be crippling for projects when project managers don't have full authority or don't have enough authority to direct work, to spend money, to do whatever, because that's what a project is about. I mean, we're doing it. We should be doing it for good reasons, and we should have the right people, and we should have a project manager as the authority figure, or they should be authorized to do things. So, formal document. Goals from the initiation phase. This is the beginning. Charters done at the end aren't really the point. We should be, if you look at this as a linear progression, the charter should be fairly early. It has the support of your key stakeholders. It should be a written agreement. And the best case scenario, and a lot of what we're talking about with these processes and the knowledge areas is the best practices. We're talking, this is the way successful companies, organizations build good projects. It should be a written agreement between the person spending the money, the sponsor, and the PM or the project management office or that organization. But it should be an agreement between those parties. One gives authorization to the other to be able to affect work, spend money, direct action, assign tasks, etc. And it's a reference. It shows the authority. It's at the beginning. We're talking about it and initiating. So we're justifying what we're doing. We're stating it in detail, and it's something we can go back to. Doesn't have to be terribly long. It needs to be as long as it needs to be and as clear as it can be. And there are a lot of charters I've seen that are huge, literally, dozens upon dozens of pages. That doesn't necessarily make it a good charter. Likewise, I've seen, one-page charters. That doesn't make them a good charter or a bad charter. It's the information in it, the accuracy of it, and especially this written agreement so that the key parties know what's expected of them and how they're going to move forward with regards to the success of that effort. Our next process is to develop the project management plan. Now here we have inputs of the project charter. So there is the assumption that we have a charter, it's in place, and it has fully authorized. That's important to understand, that to have a fully developed project management plan, that is there because now we have the authorization. The project manager is engaged. We've identified certain things. We have outputs from other processes that will come into this. So there's other things going on. And those outputs will be an input to this, to developing this project management plan. Now, the project management plan sounds elaborate, and it's more than simply a schedule. It's more than just a resource sheet. Conceptually, this is the overriding plan of how we're going to make this work. In small projects, this may be very brief. In larger ones, it might be very extensive. We have any environmental factors, the organizational process assets are also part of the input into this, this development. We use expert judgment here as one of our tools and techniques. Our facilitation techniques are also used, and we have a project management plan. Now, understand in doing this, the project management plan is really a combination of a lot of other plans, which we'll talk about. It's talked about here in this knowledge area of integration because it's the gathering of all of this information. It's integrating this whole project management philosophy, methodology, however you want to frame it. All of the processes and knowledges that we'll talk about, all the tools and techniques, we're sort of bringing that together, and we're in this process, developing that project management plan has two pieces. One, we know we have a project. We have the charter. We know we have other information that's going to be coming in. And this is not an event. This is a process. So we're bringing this stuff together, and it will evolve as we move forward. The components are the different components we'll talk about. Change management plan, the communication management plan, our configuration management plan, any cost baselines. So what do we think at the very beginning, kind of what's it going to cost? We want that into our project management plan. Our cost management plan, how we're managing the costs, who spends what, how do they spend it, how do we approve, that kind of thing. We'll talk about that in more detail. Any resource management plan that we might have, human resource or other, that we would bring into this. So all of these things, the process improvement plan, you may have none of these or all of these, but these are all possible components that you might want to have in your project management plan. These are simply sections: procurement, scope. You have a scope statement, maybe the work breakdown structure, WBS. We'll talk more about that in a different lecture, but that may be part of your project management plan. A lot of people in project management view that WBS as the plan, because it's sort of the structured schedule with resources. It gives you a who's doing what when kind of breakdown. Microsoft Project is one of the tools. There's several other project management tools out there that we get confused and call them a plan when they're really a schedule or a loaded schedule or loaded resource a map, if you will. So just be aware of that. The WBS dictionary, which we'll talk about also. All of these things we'll be bringing up later. Quality management, all of these factors, schedule baseline, schedule management, scope management, all of these types of things are potential documents within what you're trying to do. The project documents of activities. This is a huge kind of comprehensive list of things. From here, these are components. Here, project documents. And both of them are important to know. It may seem overwhelming a little right now, but understand all of these project documents, project management plan, components, these are all things that may or may not be a part of what you do, but they're potential things. And they're if you need them, if they help you be successful, that's why they're here. Find the tools that work for you, find the tools that work within your environment, and use those. Because after all, project management is all about being successful. So work towards success. We'll talk about a lot of these documents and the plan itself. But next, we're going to talk about directing and managing the project work. Now, this is another process within integration management, And here we have the inputs of the project management plan. Now, it's an active document. It's still being worked on, but the project work is happening. So you as project manager have a process to direct that work, to manage that work. And you use your plan, you use any approved change requests, and we'll talk about change management and change requests, but approved is the key word here. If it hadn't been approved, it's not a change. And a change in the project may affect the scope, it may affect the budget, it may affect the schedule, it may affect a lot of things. But it has to go through a good formal project management protocol. You have approved process to get changes into the project. Not every change gets into a project. You have it's best case scenario and proper procedures. You need that approved change request. Again, your enterprise environmental factors and your organizational process assets go into this. Your expert judgment. If you have a project management information system, you would use one to direct and manage the project work. It makes good common sense. If you don't have one, or if yours is informal, then that's fine. But you would use whatever is the processes and procedures that make sense in your environment. You would use meetings. How do you direct and manage a project? You do it by meetings. They can be, in the agile form, they do stand-ups. So it's real kind of informal and quick and dirty beginning of the day. Some can be virtual meetings, and we have lots of tools that we use nowadays to have these meetings be as comprehensive as possible and as quick as possible and as virtual from all over the world. We have meetings now. Your deliverables are your output. You are managing a project, and a project has things that have to happen and have to be delivered. It has products and services that we deliver to people. So think of those as being the output of your directing and managing the project work. You may not be delivering everything, but you are the project manager. It is your responsibility that the project deliverables happen in a timely manner and on time, on budget, on scope, and we'll hit those a lot. You may have work performance data that is an output here. Who's doing what work and how are they doing? You may have to deliver that to someone because you're in maybe a matrix situation. The functional bosses of people may want you to give them a report. If you're working with a development team, that development manager may want to know how they did. Testing team, same situation. It depends on how the organization works, but it's typical that project managers, as part of directing and managing the project work, would have a deliverable of work performance data to somebody. And you may have change requests. These are not approved yet, but you have something that happened that causes you to change the scope, the budget, something in that project. You can get those, and that's part of your directing and managing the project, is to have those change requests happen. You should be looking and being aware that changes can be requested. Have the formal process in place of some form and be able to act upon that. And then there are project management plan updates. What we're talking about here is the project management plan that we talked about briefly, which can have a lot of different moving parts, has to be updated and kept accurate. And that's part of your executing, directing, managing the project. It's part of that activities that you need to be aware of. And of course, project document. All those are the documents we looked at have potential of being updated. It may seem at times that we have a lot of floating pieces of paper or documentation. And we can. It can be document intensive, almost bureaucratical in some ways. And looking at it the way we are right now, it can feel that way. But realize what we're talking about is the conceptual side. A lot of these documents we are touching all the time anyway. We're just looking at them specifically right now. And that looking at them sometimes makes them seem like they're much more extensive than they may be. And understand, to get certification, you have to be able to balance that side of the compliance, governance side of the world that may require more documentation in your environment than mine or any other environment. It's just a factor. So, meetings, there tend to be one of three types. Generally, information exchange, weekly meeting. Who's doing what, when, where, how you doing, you have any questions, that kind of thing. You can also have brainstorming sessions, and they can be components of the same meeting if you need. But the brainstorming, it can be anything from talking about a design issue. It can be, how do we do something else? But we all brainstorm, and we can bring people together to brainstorm together. Big pieces of paper, Post-it notes, lots of different things that can happen. Another type of meeting is a decision making. We have a meeting so that we decide we're going to move forward with the project, or we're going to go into a new phase of the project, or we're going to hire somebody. So let's get together and make a decision on who we're going to hire. But typically what you're trying to do with meetings is you want to have an agenda. You want to have rules, and they should exist before the meeting, and how to engage. And an agenda doesn't have to be extensive, and you can use a very standard agenda kind of format if you have a regular meeting and keep it fairly consistent. I try and make sure when I'm meeting with people that I'm very clear what I expect. So it's expectation management. That fits in with the agenda. It fits in with the rules. Who talks, how much do they talk? And yes, you're trying to balance people, but you're trying to use this time well. Remember, if you call a meeting and you invite 10 people to it, you have said that it's a good reason for these 10 people to meet for that period of time, hour long, say, on this subject, and you are committing corporate assets. You are spending money when you do that. So as a project manager, you need to be aware. You are the steward. You have a responsibility to spend the corporate assets well. So if you're spending it, you need to be mindful of it. You need to have expectations set. Agendas are good about that. You can include a lot of things like decisions that we've made, decisions that were made since last time, action items and updates on action items. Things like issues and risks can be discussed. You can take time and update things, get updates in the meeting that can be done. You just need to work efficiently. And the way that I always view it is that if I look at every minute that I have somebody that is in my meeting with me, that I'm spending corporate assets, that helps me be more efficient. And it helps me focus on what's important so that I don't waste people's time or energy, because we all know that's the biggest complaint that almost everybody has, is that we have too many meetings and we don't get enough done when we are in meetings. And so that becomes a very big factor. And as project managers, we tend to call more than a few meetings. And so we need to be better than most people are at doing them. So just be aware. Things that you can do when you are directing, when you're managing, you can develop corrective actions, things that need to be fixed, things that you see need to happen, people who need to have some extra management perhaps, and it can be formal corrective actions, it can be informal. Talk to people, you're managing, you're directing, you're trying to get success to the project. This is where it fits in. This is the process you're doing that in. You can develop preventive actions. You know, if you see things that could go wrong, anything from as you're having your meetings or you're talking to people, you can see that perhaps there's a holiday coming up that a lot of people are going to be missing, or it's about the end of school for some folks, or maybe there's a religious holiday of some of your staff that are overseas that you know about, and you know, have preventative actions can be as easy as just trying to make sure everybody's aware and everybody is informed and you have coverage during the times that you need it. If you have defects, either in the process that you have or in the actual product or service that you are supplying, having some idea of that and identifying it is really an important piece of your directing and your managing. And realize this sometimes happens more these days with some of the iterative type of processes we're doing. And, you know, agile methodology, doing scrums, there's other iterative type of methods. This type of identifying and repairing things quickly is part of why they're popular. They allow for it. They are, you can engage in more preventative actions, more defect repair, that kind of thing. And it's one of the reasons they're popular these days. And even if you don't do full-born iterative, agile, scrum, whatever, the pieces of them can be added to your toolbox, and some of the methodologies and techniques can be very valuable to you. So I heavily suggest you keep that in mind when we look at the directing and managing of our projects. It's become more and more the norm that people are at least aware of some of the different techniques, if not using them on a regular basis. Our next process we'll talk about is the monitor and control of project work. Here we have inputs from the project management plan, our schedule forecasts. We haven't talked about those yet, but we use them when we're monitoring and controlling the project work. Our cost forecasts, again, we haven't talked about those in detail, but it makes sense. You have validated changes. Any changes that have happened that have been validated, we use those. Any work performance information that we may have gathered, our enterprise environmental factors, and organizational process assets. So it's our kind of standard grouping of things. Makes perfect sense that these would be the information we would need as we monitor, control the project work. We use our expert judgment here, as well as any analytic techniques. If you have a project management information system, then of course it would be vital to have that as a tool as we're looking at this work. And of course, meetings. We always have meetings. We have change requests that can come out of this work, where people are identifying where scope has changed, where additions have been made, where budget has changed, where the schedule has changed. And there's a lot of different things that can come up as we look at the work. We have work performance reports and any updates to the project management plan we would put in there, as well as any other project documents. And really, the project management plan, as we saw, has components in it that we really are going to be looking at closely as we move through the knowledge areas and look at their particular specialties. The project documents that are updated are just anything else outside of what's been identified as in the project management plan. So here's a new process that's coming into the next version of the PMBOK. We're noting it here, and it doesn't have an official number yet, so that's the reason we have the 4 and the asterisk. But managed project knowledge is coming to us as a process under this knowledge area, and we've made some assumptions with this because some of this is not completely detailed yet. So we know that managed project knowledge will be there. We know what managing project knowledge is pretty much. What we can do is the inputs of the project management plan. Of course, we're going to be looking at that. We're going to be looking at work reports and enterprise environmental factors, organizational process assets are typical kind of inputs as we are looking at what the project is about, what the knowledge that both we are taking from the project as well as what the project has taught us. We use our expert judgment meetings, project management information system, and we get other updates of the project management plan, any project document updates. And so it's a very straightforward new piece. As we learn more, as we find out more, that will be woven in to all the different methodologies and things. But that's one of the newer processes that we're looking at today. Our next process that we have is perform integrated change control. Now, here we have the inputs of the project management plan, work performance reports, change requests. Since we're doing change control and we're talking about integrated change control, that means that we're getting people who are reporting the things need to be adapted. As we learn more, we change things. Also, as we mentioned before, with some of the iterative processes that are being used within project management now, Agile, Scrum, other types of newer type of project management techniques, that means that change is going to be a more part of what we're doing. And making sure that we have things organized and integrated when we do change things is going to be vitally important to our success. We also have our environmental factors and our organizational process assets. Here we use our expert judgment again, meetings, of course, and any change control tools. There are a lot of various tools that people use, everything from as simple as a worksheet or it can be a database that people are using, or other more complicated, more detailed, customized type of tools are used for change control. The big thing is not the tool that you're using, it's that you keep in mind on how you're doing this change, introducing changes into your work. Because the biggest problem we have when things change is getting it fully communicated, fully understood. What are the risks? What are the unknown assumptions that people might be making when change is introduced? So we need to be organized. Output from this, obviously, is the approved change requests. So we use our expert judgment. We have meetings, we have tools, but we have to get those approved change requests and use those to move the project forward. Change logs. Anytime we're changing, we want to make sure that if we're keeping any track of it, we know version control, that kind of thing. And project management plan updates, as well as our typical project document updates. As things change, we may need to make sure everybody is aware of it, and the best place to keep that information is in these documents. Now, Change is part of life, and life is in projects. Projects are extremely interesting events because the first time you think that everything is locked in, some change happens. Now, the changes that we're really focused on as project managers are those changes within the triple constraint, within those elements. So, because that really does affect. As I talked about it in a previous lecture, anytime you alter one of those triple constraint factors, whether it's scope, whether it's the schedule, or whether it's the money, you change one, you can affect the others. So we want to be very careful with that. It needs a change requests need to be formal, and it needs to really include corrective actions. So when you're looking at a change, the request has to be formal. It must say, what are you changing? What is the corrective action? Am I asking for more budget? Am I asking for a delay in the schedule? Or am I looking at more functionality or less functionality? Changes come in different flavors. They can be adding things and they can be taking them away. If you have a budget crunch in your organization, a project may be asked to diminish their budget by 10%. That's not unheard of in the worlds that I've lived in and managed projects in. Having reductions is pretty much a regular thing. So corrective actions, preventative actions, they may something just may be to prevent things from getting worse. You may have a defect report. If you're having a change, it may be that the original design was flawed or you found something. So you may have a report that details what was wrong, and that can help drive both the correction as well as predict other things that might happen with the product or service that you're developing. Any updates, we get through the change management process, and they need to be fed to the proper places, make sure that everybody is properly communicated with. One of the things that really hurts projects is uncontrolled change. It's noted as a huge reason for projects to fail. And do note, change control and the managing of change is a big theme when we look at our certification. It's an area that really is under the control of the project manager, and the assumption is if the project manager is doing their job, then change is not unheard of, but is controlled and documented properly. And the last process that we're looking at in this knowledge area is closing the project or the phase. And we use phase here because sometimes projects are very large. The methodologies and the standards that we talk about are trying to incorporate every kind of project you could do, from the simple ones to the very long. Now, all projects have to have an ending, or they wouldn't be projects, right? They have to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Well, here's the end, closing down the project. But you could have a phase, and you could close a phase. There are similar things that work there. That's why it's included here. Our inputs, we have the project management plan. That kind of our roadmap, always, of what we're doing, how we're doing it. We have accepted deliverables. If you're closing the project or the phase, that assumes that you finished doing what you were trying to do. So you have deliverables that you've delivered, products or services that have been the object of your the project from the beginning. Those have to not only be delivered, but they need to be accepted. So whoever is in that position of accepting delivery of those deliverables, it has to do that, and that's an input into closing. You can't close a project until the deliverables have been accepted by the proper party. Organizational process assets are important in closure because we need to understand what are the rules, how do we do it, what is expected of us, and that's where we can find that information. We use our expert judgment again, and we use analytic techniques to close the project, to know it's closed. Meetings are always important, and here they are again. The final product or service is the output of this. Now, we have acceptable deliveries as an input. We can't officially close until we have the input of those deliverables, but the final product service, the result, transition into the new working order, those are all the output of closing a project down, and it's important. We also have updates to organizational process assets. We're done. We need to make sure that we announce that it's clear and it's in all the right documentation that this particular project has finished. One of the items that we talk about in closure is lessons learned. And that's a very widely used term for a lot of project managers, but sometimes it's a very underutilized concept. Here, what we're trying to understand, and the PMBOK is very on board with knowing lessons learned, valuing lessons learned. It's important to document. In some governance scenarios, it's invariable, it's required. So know what your situation is when it comes to lessons learned, and capture the problems that may or may not have been solved by a project. So you're capturing things that you can learn from in the future. You're capturing things that maybe you figured out a solution. There may have been a change request that was approved and went through. Anything you can figure out and report on is important for lessons learned. Now, when I manage a project, I always have 2 sheets of paper in my cube because I never have an office. I always have a cube. And there's 2 sheets of paper, one of which I have on the top and it says risk. On the other side of me, I have one that says lessons learned. And from my first day on the job, I try and look at each of those each day and see if I can add something to it. Risk being the things that can go wrong, and we'll be tracking and analyzing, and we'll go in a future lecture, we'll talk in detail about that. But lessons learned, as we discover things that we wish we had done differently, or new ways of doing things, or whatever we think of in lessons learned, I note them right away on that sheet of paper. And that way I don't forget them. I know a lot of projects that by the time you get to closing down the project, the last thing you want to do is sit down and discuss it again. Generally speaking, by the time your closure happens, you as the project manager may be assigned to other projects. Your team may be assigned to other projects. It can be very hard to get everybody together to talk about, what did we learn here? What could we do better? So realize we want to capture them in a timely manner, and you want to capture them so that people can learn from them, not only yourself, but others. And as I said, capture it from day one. Capturing lessons learned at the very end, you're going to forget things. And you don't have to have it formal. That's why I say it's a very informal piece of paper, just bullets is fine to begin with. The formality and how you report your lessons learned is really a part of the culture that you're in. Your particular project management office or organization will somewhat influence, if not dictate, how that's done. It's very valuable. I can't stress it enough. It's underutilized, highly valuable. And so, to recap, integration management is about kind of the big picture of what we're looking at in terms of developing the project charter, developing a project management plan. You're going to work on managing, directing the work itself, monitoring and controlling the work. You're performing integrated change control. This is where this fits in. You integrate the things that are changing and you monitor and make sure that you have it under control and everybody knows the changes being introduced into the project. You manage project knowledge. This makes perfect sense that you would do this. The knowledge that we gain and is very important we don't lose it. And so think about managing that project knowledge actively. And then we close the project. At a place you have to say enough is enough, we're done. And that's what we do here. And now some key information to review. Some key terms. We learned about project charter. Very important to understand how that works and that is the that is the device in which empowers the project manager. We talked about stakeholders. We'll go into much more detail about stakeholder and stakeholder management. We understand that they are people that have both an effect to the project and are affected by the project. They may be very, very important, but keep in mind on stakeholders. The scope statement can be brief, succinct, but we need to have a scope statement, and I use it generally a lot in meetings to try and make sure everybody knows what our project's about and what it's not about. The project management plan, encompassing a lot of different plans that we're developing as we go through this process. But the project management plan is an important and living document. We both create it and we update it on a regular basis. Meetings. We talked about meetings, and we'll continue to talk in different ways about meetings. Meetings are huge in the project world because we're doing them all the time. Be effective with them, be mindful of the meetings, and we'll talk more when we talk about communication in a future lecture. Change management, it's huge. If you don't control change, change will control you. Keep change management in your mind from day one, and be careful you don't have change just really can derail your whole project. Change control, part of change management. Lessons learned, we talked about, very valuable. And so these are the key terms that we can take from integration management, and we'll use these as we move forward.